Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and once again, I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG, on YouTube and Twitch. I do know how to say your name, but for some reason I was reading off my auto cue instead of just going from the top of my head, and so I sort of stumbled over it a little bit. But a pleasure to have you back on Novara Live today.
Likewise, as I said before, always a pleasure to be your co-host, Michael. Looking forward to the show as always.
Going to work on my elocution as we go forward. Coming up later tonight, the latest developments in Gaza, Channel 4's candid interview with an IDF soldier, Michael Gove U-turns on no-fault evictions, and we get on Tom Harwood for a debate on those, and Sadiq Khan and Susan Hall go head-to-head on LBC. 2 mass graves have been uncovered in Gaza since the beginning of April. On Monday, reports began to emerge of a mass grave at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, southern Gaza. It was discovered after Israeli troops withdrew from the besieged hospital on April the 7th, and the site reportedly contains the intermingled bodies of over 300 men, women, and children. Now, that followed the uncovering of a mass grave at Shifa Hospital in Gaza City after the IDF abandoned the site after a 2-week-long special operation there. 381 bodies have reportedly been recovered from the hospital and its surroundings, with 30 found buried in the hospital's courtyard. Some of those bodies were allegedly buried beneath piles of waste and included women and older people. And the details of some of the bodies being discovered in these graves is deeply disturbing. According to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, some appear to have been buried with their hands tied behind their backs, as well as others stripped of their clothes. Now, if that's true, it would clearly suggest executions and therefore war crimes. Photographs have also been released of bodies appearing to be in medical scrubs and with medical devices like catheters still attached. The discovery of 2 mass graves in such quick succession, as well as the accounts of the state of some of the bodies, has led to international calls for an independent investigation, including by the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights.
We are horrified also by the destruction of Al-Nasser Medical Complex and Al-Shifa Medical Complex, and the reports of the discovery of mass graves in and around facilities. And we call for independent, effective, transparent investigations into the deaths. Given the prevailing climate of impunity, this should include international investigators. Hospitals are entitled to very special protection under international humanitarian law. And let's be clear, the intentional killing of civilians, detainees, and others who are hors de combat is a war crime.
The EU has joined that call for a full investigation. But the IDF has strongly denied digging mass graves at either Shifa or Nasser, saying this about the Nasser site. During the IDF's operation in the area of Nasser Hospital, in accordance with the effort to locate hostages and missing persons, corpses buried by Palestinians in the area of Nasser Hospital were examined, exclusively in places where intelligence indicated the possible presence of hostages. No bodies of hostages were found at the site, with the IDF claiming that after examining the bodies of dead Palestinians, they were all, quote, returned to their place. In a separate statement, the IDF said that, quote, the examination was carried out respectfully while maintaining the dignity of the deceased. The IDF has also declined to say how many bodies it exhumed, but the evidence suggests that they were not simply, as the IDF say, returned to their place, and nor were soldiers likely to have maintained the dignity of the deceased. Now, we should be clear here, the Palestinians aren't denying that many of the bodies in the graves were those of people who had already died before the IDF entered the 2 hospitals. In January, before the siege of Nasser Hospital, Gazan authorities reported having to bury at least 40 bodies in makeshift graves in the hospital's grounds. That was because fighting in Khan Yunis made cemeteries inaccessible. There were similar conditions at Al-Shifa in November, when the hospital's courtyard was filled with around 100 bodies of the dead. Attempts to perform burials had been thwarted by the bombardment of Gaza City, and after the hospital's morgue failed due to electricity being cut off, the bodies were moved to the cold courtyard to prevent the spread of disease. Today, a spokesperson for Gaza's Civil Defence Force told the BBC this about the Nasser site. After research and investigation, we learned that the occupation army had established a mass grave, pulled out the bodies that were in Nasser Hospital, and buried them in this mass grave. So it seems as though at least some of the bodies in these sites were hurriedly buried by Palestinians caught in a war zone. They were then carelessly exhumed and hastily reburied by the IDF without much concern for the dignity of the dead or their families. This seems to be backed up by the relatives of the dead. So Sumaya al-Shubagi's husband, Osama, died at Nasser Hospital 3 months ago. Fighting meant she was unable to give him a proper burial and has only now recovered his body from a mass grave.
We found Osama's body, but we couldn't find the body of Muhammad, his brother. You saw the scene. There are piles of bodies, and some victims can't be found. Had we found Muhammad, we would have buried him next to his brother.
Sky News has reported analysis that suggests the IDF bulldozed the courtyard of the Nasser hospital where the dead had been buried. And this video shot during the occupation clearly shows the Israeli military using bulldozers at the site. Before and after satellite imagery also shows the damage the IDF did to the burial areas while the Nasser hospital was in their control. This image shows the Nasser courtyard on the 14th of February. The area in the top left is where Palestinians had buried those who had died at the hospital. A week later, and the courtyard has been completely dug over, with tracks consistent with bulldozers crisscrossing the earth. If that's right, then this is dehumanizing and undignified treatment of the dead, part of a wider picture of how the IDF thinks of Palestinian civilians. But, and this is what the Israelis will deny, digging up and reburying hundreds of people is also a pretty good way of concealing bodies you don't want found. For example, perhaps bodies that prove that after Israel occupied these hospitals, they committed further war crimes. And these are the scenarios which have led the UN, the European Union, and other international organizations to demand an independent investigation. That makes a lot of sense. There are a lot of bodies which is hard to account for. But our government has a radically different take. At PMQs today, Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden was standing in for Rishi Sunak when he was asked this.
Yesterday, Palestinian officials uncovered 2 mass graves outside the bombed hospitals in Gaza. These graves also constitute as a war crime, don't they?
Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, of course, we would expect the democratic government of Israel to investigate any allegations of misconduct, and that's exactly what they do, and it's exactly what the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister urge them to do. But I find it quite extraordinary that she seeks to draw parallels between the legitimate war of self-defense of Israel and the conduct of Russia.
Very black.
300 bodies, including the elderly and the injured, some of which had been stripped naked, mutilated, with their hands tied behind their backs. The UK's own arms policy states that if there is even a risk that war crimes may be taking place, then that is reason enough to halt the sale of arms. Given all we know, why then is the Prime Minister yet to do so?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, we continue to urge the Israeli government to investigate any allegations of misconduct. The difference, though, is that we can trust the Israeli government, a democratically elected government, to properly investigate those things.
See no evil, hear no evil, right? That is a guy who doesn't want to know the truth. We trust Israel, so we're going to let them investigate it. We're going to let them investigate their own actions. Suspicions that Israeli soldiers executed people. Oh, we'll just ask the Israelis. We trust the Israelis. They're a democracy. But the Israelis have done a lot of very bad things, which the whole world has seen. So having a politician stand up and say, oh, we'll let them investigate it. This idea also that there can be no possible comparison between Israel and Russia. Yes, these are very different situations. But if you want to judge this by how many children have been killed, then the Israelis have killed a lot more than the Russians have. Right? So the Russians have killed a lot of Ukrainian soldiers who, I believe, are fighting a legitimate war of self-defense. Right? It's not to say, oh, it's fine to kill Ukrainian soldiers because they're soldiers. No, if you start a war, you have caused those soldiers to be in harm's way. Right? So killing them is a terrible thing to do. But the Israelis have killed thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians, including around 14,000 children. So if we're talking about comparisons, maybe let's compare that. There was a similar story in the United States.
Follow up on that. Now, it seems that more than 300 bodies have been found. The United Nations is asking or calling for an independent investigation. Would you support such an independent investigation?
Right now, Saeed, we are asking for more information.
Right.
That is where we're leaving the conversation. Right. I don't have any details to match, confirm, or offer as it relates to that. We're aware of those reports, and we have asked the government of Israel for additional clarity and information, and that's where I'm at.
I understand. If Secretary General Guterres asked for your support in this effort, would the United States support him?
You're asking about a hypothetical, Saeed, which again, I'm not going to get ahead of until we have greater fidelity on information as to what this is. And we're hoping to get that from the government of Israel as soon as possible.
I don't really understand how that is a hypothetical, because the UN have called for an independent investigation into what has gone on, right? So the UN does want that. And the United States is refusing to say whether they will support that and saying it's a hypothetical. Of course, the UN would like the United States to support an independent investigation if they want that independent investigation to happen. And again, exactly as in the United Kingdom, the Americans say, we're not going to say any more than we've asked Israel for some more information. We've asked Israel for some more information. Now, you might remember a few weeks ago on this show, we were talking about how there was information from government sources saying the UK hadn't been able to update its legal advice on whether the Israelis were breaking international law because the Israelis hadn't provided enough information. So this idea, they might be committing war crimes, they might be tying people's hands behind their backs and then executing them, but in the information they've given us, we don't have evidence of that. Okay, well, look for your own information. It's just so clearly dishonest. Of course, these mass graves at hospital sites aren't the first discovered in Gaza. In February, at least 30 decomposing bodies of Palestinians were found in a mass grave at a school in northern Gaza. Some of the victims there were blindfolded with their hands tied behind their backs with zip ties. That's according to reports. Again, there haven't been independent investigations into this because it's incredibly difficult to have any independent investigations in Gaza right now because no journalists are allowed to turn up, right? Obviously, we should be supporting the UN to have an independent investigation by any means that they possibly can. But the idea that we say, Israel, you've banned all journalists from this place, but we're going to let you mark your own homework. And even if you don't get around to marking your own homework, we'll give you as much time as you want and we'll keep sending you weapons while we do that. So this story, there are still, we have to say, a lot of unknowns. I've seen some social media posting about it saying, these are 300 executed bodies. It doesn't seem like we have the evidence to suggest these were all people who were executed. I mean, the reason that many of them were dead in the first place, the reason that many of them had to be buried in the first place in a hospital courtyard is because Israel is fighting a genocidal war. But that doesn't mean that they got to the hospital and tied up, everyone behind their backs and then killed them. We just don't know enough to say that at this point in time. More details, though, are emerging about the practices of the Israeli Defense Forces, which means that we definitely shouldn't trust their version of events. The IDF likes to describe itself as the most moral army in the world. But Israel's assault on Gaza has exposed the emptiness of that claim. Would a moral army really carry out collective punishment on a population of trapped civilians? Would a moral army kill 14,000 children? Of course, Israel has defended its approach in Gaza by arguing that Hamas uses civilians as human shields, which is itself a war crime. But Channel 4 News has interviewed an IDF soldier who suggests that's not really what's going on. The soldier's identity is concealed and his words are spoken by an actor.
A lot of them don't draw the line between what we call militants or terrorists and what we would call civilians. After the 7th, for example, people saw those videos of those people being paraded through the streets around Gaza, right? And those people cheer or even take part in whatever it is. So they say, all of them are part of it. They all support it.
Was that quite a widespread view that everyone in Gaza is complicit?
Very much so. For many of the people around me, that was the thing. It came from saying, those are the kids that we spared in the war in 2014, right? Those are the kids that we spared then are now the terrorists that did the 7th, right?
It's a bit the implication there being, if you kill a kid now, it's okay.
Everyone, yeah. That was, I don't want to say the majority, but it was alarmingly widespread in the people around me talking about this.
Now, that is a genocidal culture saying, oh, the people who carried out, a small number of people who carried out this attack on October the 7th, they were the children we should have killed in 2004. Right? So that's saying we should kill Palestinian kids in case in the future they want to fight us. I mean, there's obviously lots of reasons why a Palestinian might want to fight Israel, because they'll have killed their parents, killed their siblings, potentially maimed them, and they will have occupied their land for the past 56 years or 75, depending on what definition you use. Right? So it wouldn't be surprising if a Palestinian child now grows up to want to fight Israelis. But the idea, well, one, I mean, it would be better if you sort of took away those reasons by giving a solution which creates some sort of justice, stop killing people's families. But two, you can't preemptively kill children in case they turn out to be your enemies, right? That's the language of genocide. And in reference to the previous story, the idea that that is what an Israeli soldier is telling us is, that's the culture within the armed forces. And we, as the British and the Americans, are saying, if there were any wrongdoings, we're asking the Israelis for more information. We're assuming they're going to investigate themselves, right? Is that really how you hold a genocidal army to account? Is that really enough that we can be still sending them weapons and arms and providing them diplomatic cover at the UN? Of course, we don't have a clear figure on civilian deaths in Gaza yet, in part because journalists can't go there. But given that over 34,000 people have been killed so far, it's likely to be extremely high. And on this show, we've shown footage of civilians being killed by Israel's military many times. Right? We know that tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. So how do Israeli soldiers react when they murder civilians?
No one is batting an eye. No one is questioning. It's like, it's a given that if someone is in this area that we are in because everyone was supposed to be evacuated, if someone is there, they are Hamas. There was a guy holding something white or having a white t-shirt that was like, what's going on the radio? And he was approaching one of the places where one of the units was. And then the soldiers starts yelling, like in Arabic, like, stop, or I will shoot you. And then the person starts running away. And then he shoot them and kill them. And then you ask yourself, like, did we just kill someone who was just, trapped in the situation?
Were other soldiers around you, were they worried by what happened? Troubled by it?
Not really. I don't remember anyone talking about that. I think the thing here is they need to prove that they are not the enemy. The ground assumption is that they are Hamas. And then if you go this way, you are bound to kill people that are not, right?
How do you prove you're not the enemy, right? If you go and wave a white flag to these people, they'll kill you anyway. How do you prove you're not the enemy, right? Beyond, I suppose, they can't leave the vicinity, right? Wherever you go in Gaza, you're subject to being bombed. And many people trapped in hospitals, for example. And again, I think this is important context when you're thinking about mass graves being exhumed. The Israelis say, oh no, these were all people that died beforehand. Obviously, our soldiers wouldn't have executed anyone and sort of buried them and tried to cover up the evidence. We're not that kind of army. We're a very moral army. No, this is the kind of army that shoots people running away, carrying white flags, and then doesn't have a second thought about it. And when Israel appeared before the International Court of Justice, South Africa argued that statements by Israeli politicians were fueling IDF soldiers' bloodlust in Gaza. And that's something the soldier here appeared to confirm.
Were there many soldiers serving around you who were supporters of extremist politicians, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, figures like that?
There are, and sometimes also in a quite higher positions. There are people who live in the West Bank, or people that used to live in Gaza and Gush Katif, right? And when you hear them speak, that is chilling. When they talk about Palestinians, when they talk about the solution that they see to this conflict, those things are really, really scary.
What kind of stuff would they say?
There are no uninvolved, only unarmed.
That was a common phrase?
Not a common phrase. I heard it from a few people. It became like common in specific circles.
That's not just the Ben-Gvirs actually in cabinet. That's sort of what Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, a Labour politician, right? This is supposedly someone who's on the moderate end of the Israeli spectrum. He was very much the guy who was saying, no one is innocent, right? Everyone is implicated to some degree in Gaza, and therefore anyone who dies, it's pretty much their fault. Right? That's why, by the way, the International Court of Justice were very, very clear that using genocidal language itself is an action that falls within the Genocide Convention, because what you're doing is normalizing genocidal acts by frontline soldiers. Of course, if you're in a position of political leadership, that is the implications of what you're saying. Of course, it's not just on the ground troops who have little regard for civilian lives, and nor is it an attitude that's gradually developed as the war has worn on. This is how the soldier described the initial aerial-only attack on Gaza.
At what stage did you start to have concerns about how the war was being fought?
I was serving in a commanding unit of a battalion that was fighting in Gaza. On the first couple of weeks, no one went in, right? So we were just sitting on our asses, essentially looking in screens, essentially the drones going above Gaza. You just go through those channels and you look for those buildings just falling. It feels like Netflix, it feels like a video game for the first couple of days. But there is a moment you realize it's a freaking actual house. It just got completely destroyed. And I don't know, but there probably were some people in there. Maybe there are terrorists, maybe there are not, or Hamas, whatever. But you don't know. And then you start asking yourself, are all of those strikes, airstrikes, necessary? Or are we just having a light hand on the trigger here? And then it starts, and once it starts, it never stops.
A really powerful testimony there from a soldier in the IDF. Very brave to come forward, very valuable. I mean, you'd hope that's the kind of evidence that would be heard at the International Court of Justice, and that our government would be paying attention to, instead of just saying, oh, they're a democracy, we can trust everything they say, we've asked them for more information. Helena, how important is it to hear testimony like that from members of the Israeli army who are sort of willing to come forward and say what the culture within the organization is actually like?
I mean, there's a large kind of broader movement of ex-IDF soldiers who've come out, given statements, breaking the silence, I believe the group is called, but having these things being openly discussed, especially on like Western news channels. And to be fair, Channel 4 News have done a really good job at being pretty even-handed in a very one-sided media landscape in this country. Having these stories that are directly from people who've been, close up and into the people who are involved in these situations allows us to be able to cut through a lot of the kind of manufactured consent over this issue that comes by only hearing official statements or statements made through politicians or through political entities or spokespeople. It gets you right to the heart of the people who've been there and seen these things happening firsthand. When you hear these things, it should be shocking, right? It should be shocked to hear the statements about the kind of things that happen here, but it's not shocking anymore because this has been clearly happening for years. Deliberate attacks on civilians with no concern about whether or not you're targeting somebody who isn't or is not a legitimate target. We saw this during the Great March of Return, civilians, journalists, medical professionals being, essentially assassinated by IDF snipers during the Great March of Return. And it comes down to back the previous story we were talking about with regards to this idea that we can allow Israel to do their own investigation, as Oliver Dowden said, into the state of the mass graves. Of course, the fact that they exist in the first place, as you say, is down to the fact that there has been a genocidal war being waged by Israel in the Gaza Strip. That's the reason why the mass graves exist. But regardless, the idea that we can allow Israel to so we can personally investigate rather than have it be done independently, these cases of whether or not somebody's died as a civilian or not, we already have record for this with Shireen Abu Akleh, where it was, we didn't do it. It was somebody else that did it. Or maybe we did do it, but it was a mistake. Or, well, we did do it and it was deliberate, but that's too far in the past that the story is now irrelevant, at least as far as the general public is concerned. These things have to be either called out internally by whistleblowers, or they have to be done independently from the outside. And we talk about the kind of things that were spoken with regards to the attitudes of people, both in Israeli society, but broadly amongst those about their political and military positions, the ways in which that they discuss the people of Palestine, discuss people, and the kind of dehumanizing language that we hear. Now, this, to me, personally, this is the problem with ethno-nationalism as a concept. And in fact, when you think about what the kind of military commanders are doing, there's pretty stark comparisons with the kind of things that were happening and the kind of statements that were made by military generals, by people in the Haganah during the Nakba. These kind of ways in which that when you are committed to an ethno-nationalist project, You therefore will disregard so many other concerns that might impede you in engaging in that project. And that's what happened during the Nakba, and is what is happening now. Look at the mass graves, for example, the ways in which the crimes against humanity were committed against the Palestinians during the Nakba. These were kind of covered up, or these were not released to the public for decades and decades and decades. It's only now, thanks to the new historians that we have, who got hold of declassified documents, which we only have because of whistleblowers and people like that who would allow us to see them, who can be able to look back on the events of 1940 and go, no, like atrocities were committed, again, by people who had a desire for an ethno-nationalist project. And that's exactly the kind of carbon copy of what we are seeing right now. Israel will keep all of the information that we need to see under lock and key, because journalists aren't allowed to go in unless they've got IDF escort. Information is coming out in dribs and drabs through social media, through Palestinian Telegram channels. And we won't know the full scale of what's been happening both internally within Israel and what's been happening on the ground in Gaza, probably for many, many years to come, because of how difficult that is and how important it is that whistleblowers come out and speak. One last thing I would say with regards to what we were talking about, or what people on the ground in Israel think about what's happening in Gaza, it's really important to understand how much of this can be put down to things like manufactured consent within the Israeli population. The information they receive about what's happening on the ground in Gaza is gatekept. It's all through the kind of genocidal statements we've heard from Israeli officials, from the pundits on their TV screens, that they only see this filtered rhetoric and narrative about the events of Gaza, who Hamas represent, what the Palestinians want, the kind of things that the Palestinians are subjected to. And so through that singular biased narrative, it's really easy to impugn people in Israel for supporting the actions of their government. But manufactured consent is a really powerful tool to be able to ensure that you have support for the kind of atrocities that are being engaged in right here. And it's only because we have all of the information directly at our fingertips that we can properly see, at least now, some of the extent of the problems that are going on. But again, as far as broadly the atrocities that we've seen, we won't probably see the full scale of these for many years to come.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And of course, I mean, it's in Israel's interest, and I suppose also in the Britain and America's interest, because they've been supporting this war for that time period, between now and when we find out what's actually been going on, the full details. They want that to be as long as possible, because the further it is in the past, the easier it is to sort of brush over it, which is why these things often get dragged out. And I suppose you could see the continuation of the war on Gaza as, in a way, just dragging out the period between, if they invade Rafah, we will see sort of another sort of phase in the war, which is as intensely deadly as the start. But it did seem like, most of the deaths were sort of weighted towards the beginning of the war, but the longer the war goes on, the longer it will take for us to find out sort of the full reality of what happened in the very recent past, which does give Netanyahu at least sort of an interest in continuing this thing. In their 2019 manifesto, the Tories committed to abolish no-fault evictions. Thanks to opposition from landlord MPs, that was delayed and delayed and delayed. But in February this year, Michael Gove confirmed the Tories would get rid of the dreaded Section 21.
You promised in 2019 in your manifesto that you were going to get rid of what's called Section 21, where landlords can evict tenants for no reason.
Yes.
It hasn't happened yet. Can you guarantee the 11 million renters in this country that you will end this before the general election?
Yes, we have a bill. It's gone through its stages in the House of Commons, and that bill does a number of things to help people in the private rented sector, including ending no-fault evictions.
So that was in February, but fast forward to this week, and Michael Gove has now abandoned that pledge. He's told the BBC that the Tories can no longer guarantee that they will ban no-fault evictions before the next general election. The U-turn was the subject of PMQs today, which featured both parties' deputies.
I know the party opposite is desperate to talk about my living arrangements. but the public want to know what this government is going to do about theirs. Natalie from Brighton has been served with 2 no-fault eviction notices in 18 months. She joins nearly 1 million families at risk of homelessness due to his party's failure to ban this cruel practice. Now, instead of obsessing over my house, when will he get a grip and show the same obsession with ending no-fault evictions?
Well, to begin with, it is a pleasure to have another exchange with the Right Honourable Lady in this House, our 5th in 12 months. Any more of these, and she'll be claiming it as her principal residence.
It wasn't actually a bad comeback from Oliver Dowden. Of course, they were there both joking about the, well, I'm going to put it in scare quotes, controversy, because I don't think it should be particularly controversial. The issue around which property Angela Rayner had registered as her primary address after she got married. I think sort of having it somewhat ambiguous where your primary address is, sort of as you have a blended family where you've sort of married someone when you've already got, all seems somewhat reasonable to me. It all seems very, very overblown. But anyway, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. And that was just to show you the theatre of this discussion. And we should, though, look more in detail at the nature of this U-turn. Because in theory, the bill going through the Commons today, so the Renters Reform Bill, does in fact ban Section 21s. In theory. However, and this is what's key, thanks to amendments put forward by backbench Tory MPs, many of them landlords, the bill going through the Commons specifies that the ban on Section 21s will only come into force subject to a review into how it would affect England's court system. And that means that in practice, we don't know when it will come into force or even if it will come into force at all. And for that reason, the coalition of groups that lobby for renters have withdrawn their support for the bill. This statement is from the Renters Reform Coalition, which includes organisations such as Shelter, Crisis, and the London Renters Union. So they say, instead of engaging with us, the bill has been watered down again and again and again by the government with several rounds of damaging concessions to backbench MPs that have fundamentally weakened it. The amendments tabled recently by the government are just the final straw. The result of all the government's backtracking is that we now have a bill that abolishes Section 21 in name only. There is no guarantee it would ever fully abolish Section 21, and even then, the new tenancy system set to replace it will be little better. This legislation is intended to give the impression of improving conditions for renters, but in fact, it preserves the central power imbalance at the root of why renting in England is in crisis. Now, perhaps tellingly, while the Renters Reform Bill has now lost the support of renters groups, it has won the support of their landlords. Ben Beadle is chief executive of the National Landlords Association. He said this about the bill this morning. The bill isn't perfect, but last-minute carping is unhelpful, especially as it will represent the most dramatic change for 30 years. The bill strikes a careful balance in order to give renters security, landlords confidence, and ensure a healthy and vibrant private rented sector, one that contributes £45 billion to Treasury coffers and helps support almost 400,000 jobs. We mustn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Now, when they sort of make these claims about how much it provides to Treasury coffers and how many jobs it creates, I always think this is somewhat ridiculous because they didn't build the homes. They just bought a home and got someone else to pay them rent. Now, if I wasn't paying my landlord rent, I would be spending that money on other things, and it would also make its way into the Treasury, but it would be via me sort of buying goods and services, not paying money to someone to sit on their ass because they had enough capital to get a mortgage on the home that I live in. Right? So I find all of these claims somewhat ridiculous from the Landlords Association. But I think the real point here is that this was a bill which was supposed to give power to renters vis-a-vis landlords. So to say, landlords currently have too much power, let's give more power to renters. That was the idea. And it was initially supported by renters groups and opposed by landlord lobbyists. Now, after a bunch of amendments from backbench Tory MPs, the renters have withdrawn their support and the landlords now say, actually, we really love this bill. And I think that tells you a lot about the bill, and it tells you a lot about whose side this government is on. Not everyone is disappointed, though. Tom Harwood from GB News tweeted this today. The language of no-fault evictions is a nasty little lie. I'm flabbergasted by how many otherwise sensible people have taken on this insane wording to describe the act of someone leaving a property at the end of the fixed term for which they have agreed to rent it. Now, this afternoon, I was in the mood for a debate, so I spoke to Tom Harwood earlier today, and I began by asking him to expand on why he thinks the language of no-fault evictions is a nasty little lie.
It seems like it's a really deceitful means of describing an issue. I wish people would just be honest when they're talking about abolishing no-fault evictions. They're talking about abolishing the idea of having fixed-term tenancies at all. But that's not how it's described. And so you get the idea when you hear the words no-fault eviction, you sort of think people are being turfed out in the middle of some fixed term that they've agreed to rent a property for. When you hear the term no-fault evictions, you think that's awful, that there are some really unscrupulous practices going on, that people have agreed to rent a property for a certain amount of time and they're just getting chucked out for no reason at all during that amount of time they've agreed to rent it for. But that's not what the term means at all. That's not what's in the legislation. That's not what the campaigners are campaigning for. What a no-fault eviction actually is in the terms of how it's written about in the bill, it's about asking someone to leave a property at the end of the fixed term for which they've agreed to rent it, which doesn't really sound like an eviction at all. It seems like it's a bit of sleight of hand, a bit of political misdirection, or as I wrote in my tweet, a nasty little lie.
So I know you think the framing of a no-fault eviction is deceitful. I suppose where I would potentially see the deceit in your argument is this framing of a contract between two people as this completely, equal agreement that's been made. The renter only wants a short-term contract. The landlord only wants a short-term contract. So what's the problem? They've mutually agreed to this. And I suppose a story from my life, I don't think I'm the real victim here, by the way, but so we had a rent increase a couple of years ago. We said, okay, fine, we will pay it. We know that the prices in the area are quite high, but we would like some certainty. Can we have a 24-month contract? They said, no, we're raising your rent and we're only going to give you a 12-month contract. Now, for me, that was frustrating, but it was, I could live with that. But if you're in a situation where you've got more and more of the population who are starting families and still living in the private rental sector, I'm not really sure how it is acceptable for us to sort of keep a situation whereby people raising children never know for more than 12 months where they're going to be living, right? And if you've got a landlord who doesn't even want to give you a 12-month contract, so say your first 12-month contract ends and then you're on a rolling contract, you're there with your kids in the flat, and you don't know if you're going to have to move in 2 months' time, at any point in time, right? And yet that might mean ripping your kids out of their catchment area, moving to the other side of town when they've already started school. And I think if we are going to have a society, which it seems we are moving to, where you have more and more people living in the private rental sector, then we have to offer some security to private renters, the same kind of security that someone would get in the public sector. So if they're a council tenant or if they're a homeowner. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, there are two things there. Firstly, you sort of given the game away there. You asked for a longer term contract because you understand that the contracts that you agree with your landlord, at the end of that contract, that's the end of your contract, right? That's how everyone understands.
Well, so I understand. I understand it. But why I asked for it, so you're talking about language, right? Yeah. Now, if you want, for this debate, we can talk about Section 21s instead of no-fault evictions. But the reason I asked for 24 months was because I wanted to level the playing field somewhat, right? As long as I'm on a rolling contract, then my landlord has all the power. They can wake up the following day and say, you know what? I don't really like those guys, and I'm out in 2 months. And as I say, for me, that's frustrating. If I were raising kids, I think that would be unbearable.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you that this is not a balanced situation. But the way that you rectify an unbalanced situation isn't by undermining contract law and with all of the consequences that
this isn't undermining contract law, because you'd just be signing different contracts, wouldn't you?
The way that you rectify that is by rebalancing supply and demand. The way that you control the excesses of landlords isn't by trying to do things that might actually decrease that supply in the first place, or place more stringent conditions on tenants when they apply for property in the first place, making that process all the more horrible, as I think would be the unintended consequences of legislation like this. You rectify this situation is by building so many more houses, having an influx of so many more landlords into the market, that they're competing for tenants' business rather than tenants competing for landlords' business. That's how you flip the calculation here. You don't have to change the rules of the game. You have to change the players.
On one level, we're in somewhat agreement here because we both want to build lots more houses. I'd say you're a right YIMBY. You just want deregulation and you're going to hope the developers do it. I'm more of a left YIMBY. I'd like the state to play a very active role in building the homes. But even if you look at a country that does build many more homes than us, so say Germany, for example, they build a lot more homes than us. They have a lot more homes per person. Now, because they have a large proportion of the population living in the private rental sector, they still do have as standard rolling tenancies. And rolling tenancies, by that I mean a tenancy which is unending and where a landlord has to have a good reason to kick you out, because they recognize that if you've got people living in the private rental sector, they need some certainty. People need to know that they're going to be able to remain in the same community in which they live. They also have fixed-term tenancies, which are pretty much for students. And I think the law which is being put forward would sort of have a bit of a carve-out for students. So the idea that you could build... I want to build loads more houses, by the way, but the idea that you could build so many houses that landlords are begging for tenants, to me, seems somewhat far-fetched. And also what you would be doing in that situation, even if we could do that, what about all those parents of kids who have no certainty for the next 10 years until we've managed to build 4 million houses or whatever it takes to have the situation you're talking about?
You don't have to look that far in the past to see a situation where the balance of tenants to those that let out their houses was not so completely turned on its head as it is now. You don't actually have to look that far back in the past to see a situation where property was affordable in this country, where you didn't have the sort of queues outside new flats that come on the market, or hundreds of people applying for new flats in some of the most sought after areas of the country. I mean, it's not unimaginable to go back to that situation that worked a lot better when we had a better ratio of those who wanted to live in rented accommodation compared to those that had rented accommodation to let out. And I worry that we really let politicians off the hook.
Can you, sorry, when are you talking about? When was that? What's the era where you think that landlords were competing for tenants as opposed to the other way around?
The biggest example of the massive decrease of house prices that we saw most significantly was the 1930s, when we built so many more houses. It accounted for a majority of our growth. It was behind the sort of economic...
You are also talking about a period where lots of people lived in slums, right? So one of the reasons that after the Second World War, we had a planning act, we had sort of councils coming in and saying we're going to have to build loads of properties, is because you had people living in slums, right? You had slum landlords. So the idea that sort of the attractive thing we should do is go back to the 1930s, I'm not sure if that's going to be a great selling point for your proposals.
I understand the rhetorical trick that you've done there, but I do want to just get back to
history.
No. This is the fundamental point here. The last time that we had the highest amount of house building in this country was the mid-1930s. It then collapsed during the war. It never got back up to that rate of housing
people
growth.
Still lived in slums. I mean, if in your argument, why were people then living sort of whole families to a bedroom?
But Michael, what I'm saying is that was the peak amount of building. Ever since 1945 onwards, we got less and less and less building. And as a result, things got worse and worse and worse over time. Now, I think it is interesting to look back. You didn't feel the particularly acute consequence of that, for example, in the 1960s or in the 1980s. People still were able to get onto the property ladder very easily, or indeed renting was not an enormous part of people's income, because income was growing because there was supply relative to the population that was relatively plentiful. Of course, it's felt like it's been hitting a huge pinch as our population has boomed relative to the amount of property available in the last 30 years or so. And of course, as the way people live in houses.
I just want to come back to the idea that this is a rhetorical point, because I suppose when I'm giving my left YIMBY argument, sort of what I'm saying is an era which was pretty good, actually, was the 40s and the 50s. Lots of people who were living in slums could upgrade to a decent home that wasn't leaky. You didn't have the whole family living in one bedroom. You had an indoor toilet, right? These are all good things. And we were building shed loads of housing. So I'm saying a good left YIMBY looks at the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. There were conservative governments, by the way, that built as many council homes as Labour did. So it doesn't have to be a sort of partisan thing. But you're saying as the right YIMBY, the period you look to is the 1930s.
Well,
and to me, but the point then is, to me, if you're saying would you prefer to live in the housing environment of the 1930s or the 1950s? The 1930s is when you... Why is that disingenuous? I don't understand why that's disingenuous.
Because if we had not had the Town and Country Planning Act come into force in the late 1940s, and we had the same level of private development throughout the 1940s and 50s and 60s as we did in the 30s, it would also be that level, that quality, that modern. Just because something happens in a later decade where technology has moved on, that's not a point that only the government could have done that. But I think there's another point here, which is very, very important. And I think lefty MPs often forget it. The UK has one of the highest proportion of social housings in the world. In the OECD, I think we're fourth highest in terms of the proportion of our overall housing stock that is social housing. The problem here isn't a lack of social housing. As a proportion of our housing stock, we have an unusually high degree of social housing.
Well, so we do have a
need to use that social housing because private housing is too expensive.
So we do have a high proportion of social housing compared to other countries. What we do have, though, is a situation whereby the state does not take a proactive role when it comes to private housing. So what you've got in Germany, for example, which does seem to be, somewhere where the housing situation is much better. People live in larger flats, they pay lower rent, or they pay lower sort of mortgages if they're buying a house. They have the state gets very involved in parceling out land. They buy up the land. They try and suppress land prices. What we have in this country is because of deregulation in the city, for example, and because the state doesn't get involved here, you have lots of people speculating over the small amount of land which is available to develop. I just want to come back very briefly, though, to this point about no-fault evictions.
About land banking there, because I don't think that that's a particularly viable argument.
Let's go back to, well, I mean, clearly land is very expensive in this country. It's not just about land banking. It's all about hope. It's also about hope price versus sort of real price. So if you've got many countries where you say the state is going to buy up your land and you can't say, well, if you're going to give it planning permission, then it's going to be worth 10 times the amount. One of the reasons why property is expensive in this country is because land is so expensive. You'd say one of the reasons is because we don't make enough developable land available. I'd say it's also because we don't have the kind of regulations that you need to suppress land prices. I just want to finish with this one question about no-fault eviction. So the reason put forward even by the Conservative Party why we need to end the possibility of a Section 21, a no-fault eviction, whatever you want to call it, is because there is the possibility that landlords have of revenge evictions. So they can say, or a renter can say, look, I've got mold in my room. I want you to fix it. The landlord can say, oh, I kind of don't really like these tenants anymore. And then within 2 months, they can kick you out. And this isn't hypothetical. This is sort of something which is recorded, happening over and over again. And probably as significant as the existence of actual revenge evictions is the fear of revenge evictions, which means that tenants don't complain about problems in their homes. So how would you sort of stop that beyond sort of building so many houses over a 10-year period that landlords are begging for renters to stay in their bedrooms? How would you fix that without getting rid of no-fault evictions?
The only way that you can fix this stuff is by redressing that fundamental imbalance that exists in the first place, because whatever rules you have, and Section 21 is an example of it, unscrupulous landlords will find ways around it. And fundamentally, if there are people willing to rent new property that is frankly squalid because there is so little property available, people will live in those conditions. We see this all over the world. We even see it in Germany, which you continue to cite rather extraordinarily, because the waiting lists for new properties in Germany are so very high. This is one of the unintended consequences about abolishing the idea of fixed term tenancies at all. Landlords have to be so very sure of the people that they take on that actually it's much more onerous to get a property in the first place, to get that first step onto a ladder. Yes, you're sitting pretty if you're finally in a flat, but for people that are moving into an area, for young people, for people that haven't been in a particular area all their lives, it becomes so much harder because the limited stock available is sort of gold-plated and reserved. And you get these two classes of renters develop. That is a totally unsatisfactory position, but politicians are happy to say it because they are still living in an area where everyone is sort of gold-plated in their flats as if time has been frozen. They'll continue to vote for those politicians and think everything is absolutely fine. But things aren't fine because the real market value of these things has been soaring because there hasn't been any construction. You're giving excuses to politicians to continue this absolutely insane status quo, whereby we get away with such little building, preserve the values of people, not just who own property, but in the world in which we've abolished the idea of fixed term tenancies, also preserve the value of those that are lucky enough to have already been in flats. They become just as much a gilded elite as those who are lucky enough to buy property when it was cheaper. Suddenly you have a very small cast of people who are wealthy not through the property that they own, but through the property that they happen to be in and protected under this new legislation. And then you have everyone else who can't move to the area, who can't get into those new flats, and the politicians who are sitting pretty, pretending they've fixed a problem that very much still continues to exist.
We're on the same page in terms of this is only going to work if you also build a lot more houses. But in terms of where the class of sort of hyper-privileged people, and when it comes to housing, are sort of more closed off, I would say that's more the case in the UK than it is in Germany, where they have way more regulations than us. But thank you very much for a spirited debate. A pleasure to have you on Novara for the first time, Tom.
Pleasure.
That was Tom Harwood speaking to me earlier. I'm pleased to see, so we put in a poll in the comments. Do you want to see more debates with right-wingers on Novara Live? Yes, 72%. No, 28%, which I'm quite pleased about. Because I really do like having debates and conversations with people who I fundamentally disagree with. And I feel like maybe it's a bit of a shame that I only get to do that when I'm on the mainstream media and never get to do that when I'm on our own channel. So it does seem like you do want to see more disagreement on the show. So we'll have a think about that. Do let us know if you've got any suggestions for people you'd like us to invite on. Of course, I always do really appreciate it when people who we disagree with do agree to come on. So thanks to Tom Harwood for that. Sadiq Khan is standing for re-election as London Mayor in a week's time. By quite a stretch, he's the favourite to win, and that's in part because of the quality of his opposition. In hustings on LBC this week, the Tory candidate Susan Hall was challenged on her use of social media.
You liked a post calling Sadiq Khan a traitor rat. You made a baseless claim that he supported electoral fraud. You employed an Islamophobic trope about Londonistan. Is that the musings of a serious politician?
I have apologised for my social media a long time ago, and many times, and I have learnt from that. I rarely use.
What have you learnt?
I've learnt that you have to be very, very careful when you just flick on things without thinking twice about it. But I've apologised for that, and I've learnt.
They're not just hurty words.
And I've learnt from I have learnt from my mistakes.
Sadiq Khan.
Well, this is very serious because it affects me and my personal safety and my family's personal safety.
Would you feel safe in a London run by someone who tweeted and liked those things?
I'm very careful what I say now, and I've thought long and hard about this, Tom. I fought 3 council elections. I've fought 3 parliamentary elections. This is my 3rd mayoral election. The Tory candidate is the most dangerous candidate I fought against.
Well, I think that's an outrageous comment.
Now, however dangerous you think Susan Hall is, she's certainly out of step with most of London. The Tory candidate has endorsed Donald Trump. She wants to move Notting Hill Carnival out of Notting Hill. And this is most unforgivable. She's called Gemma Collins a, quote, stupid, fat, blonde woman. Right? You do not come for Gemma Collins. Very, very unpleasant. She also said she'd say it to her face, which I think is probably even nastier. She also seems all over the place when it comes to policy. Last week, she said this when asked about Sadiq Khan rolling out universal free school meals to all of London's primary school kids.
Why you feel as though a system which has lots of children's charities are very against rolling back on a universal system. So I'm interested into why you feel that a means-tested system is the way to go, because it does affect so many young people.
Yes, in London. It does. It's if it's targeted, then you can give people more nutritious meals. I've been knocking on doors now for nearly a year. People are telling me the quality of these meals aren't good and they're sending their kids in with packed lunch. Mm-hmm. We're looking at £140 million. That money could be targeted to the kids that really need that, far better than a blanket target for everybody.
Now, I disagree with that position. And I think there are lots of really good reasons why having universal free school meals is worth the money, right? Lots of studies show it makes people, work better at school. It's also nice to have everyone sort of eat together and get food together. So I disagree with her. But one thing you can say about Susan Hall's answer there is that it was coherent, right? If you have universal free school meals, you are also subsidizing richer people. And in theory, that money could be more targeted. It's the classic argument between universalism and having targeted support. So I think she's wrong, but it was coherent. However, in the LBC hustings, she bizarrely completely changed her mind. Asked whether she would commit to keeping universal free school meals, she said this.
Yes, I did, and I actually committed to it before Sadiq Khan did. So there's no... I did, and that can be documented. That has been documented. I've agreed, yes, and it's going ahead for another year.
You're going to keep universal free school meals?
Yes, and when we look at the cost of living, perhaps we should remember that Sadiq Khan has put up council tax by 70% since he's been in.
I'll come to that in just a moment. You said relatively recently, though, didn't you, that you thought the idea of universal free school meals was wrong, that it would allow for the children of millionaires to receive a free school meal at the expense, perhaps, of children who would need it.
But nevertheless, I said I'll continue it.
So you've had to change your mind on this?
No, I said I'd go ahead with it. It's documented out there, the late last year, before Sadiq Khan said he would do it.
So you're not opposed to the principle of taxes paying for free school meals for already wealthy Londoners?
For children that need feeding, I would think that they should have a nutritional, high-quality meal. And that's what we've agreed to continue for another year.
How much does that cost?
140 million.
Sadiq Khan, you would continue this on for children in secondary school?
Well, congratulations, you've got the Tory candidate perform a U-turn live on air.
It's very confused. So a week ago, she's saying it's a terrible idea to have universal free school meals. It should be targeted. Now she's saying, oh no, I'm fine with keeping it. Now, so the way to square this circle is she's saying she's going to keep it for a year. So presumably, if she were to put forward a coherent argument now, she would say, yes, in principle, I'm against it, but obviously I don't want to, change the rules immediately, so I'm going to keep it going for another year, and then I'll get rid of it. But instead, she's just got this completely bizarre sort. I suppose she's trying to speak depending on who her audience is. So if she thinks that there might be a right-wing person listening, she says, oh no, we shouldn't have universal free school meals. And if she thinks a left-wing person is listening, she might say, oh no, I am going to keep it for a year before I get rid of it. Doesn't seem very coherent or persuasive to me, which is good for Sadiq Khan. It's not only Susan Hall, though, who has some potentially incoherent policies. The Greens raised eyebrows in a video this week, promising they would reduce murders in the capital to zero. Now, that would be great, of course. No one wants murders. I'd love zero murders in the capital. But is it realistic? Now, that was put to Green candidate Zoe Garbett in the LBC hustings.
I think, Zoe Garbett, you've suggested that you would like to see no murders in London in 10 years.
Yeah,
that's fantasy land. That's not going to happen.
I think we have
to... terrible, but there's nowhere else in the world.
We have to absolutely set what our ambitions are, and I think any higher than... No. Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to, because then all of our strategies and all of our policies aim towards that. I've worked in the NHS, and we have targets and policies working towards addressing mass inequalities. And I think if you don't set a bold target, you're not going to take the action to get there.
Now, I suppose it's all very well to say, well, it's a target, but there's no point in having a target unless it's also, kind of a pledge to get there, because anyone can set a target. Obviously, if we were to pick a target out of the air, we'd all say, oh, we'd like zero murders. But if you say we're going to pledge zero murders, right, we're going to have this target of zero, you're suggesting that's possible. And I have to say, I share the host's reaction to that pledge to achieve zero murders in a city of 9 million people. That's the important thing here, right? A lot of people live in London. And the defence from a Green London Assembly member didn't exactly reassure me that they'd thought through this idea. So Zach Polanski, all-round good guy, he tweeted this. You'll see that people like to sniff at the idea of zero murders in London, but it's not what but if that's not what your target is, why not? Why engage at all? And then he says, take a look at the capital city labelled the US murder capital, who got to, checks notes, zero murders. Right? Now, that seems, okay, wow, what is this US capital that got to zero murders? That seems very interesting. If an American capital city got murders down to zero, perhaps we can too. However, when you read the article Polanski has linked to, it says this about the city in question. East Palo Alto, wedged between San Francisco Bay and Palo Alto, was home to little more than 28,000 people in the last census count, and the median household is about $100,000. Right, so if you've got a population of 28,000 people, that's more than 300 times smaller than London, and everyone there seems quite middle class. Median household income is 100,000. I'm not sure that's comparable to London. So I'm not really convinced by this pledge. Now, if you're at home thinking, why is Michael harassing the Greens? He's being too hard on the Greens. They deserve a right of reply. Don't worry, they will get one, because I will have Zoe Garber on Friday's show. So she'll have a chance to put forward her argument as to why zero murder pledge, or why a zero murder pledge, isn't completely pie in the sky. Of course, we'll also talk about the Greens' other policies for London. For now, though, Helena, I want to get your view on this. What's your read on the London mayoral race? Do you think a pledge for zero murders in a city of 9 million people is reasonable and sensible?
Things, I'm a member of the Green Party, so obviously my views on this are going to be pretty skewed, so I was going to want to declare that first of all. I think broadly, right, I obviously have my disagreements. I'm allowed to have disagreements with the party I'm a member of, and I would rather see, when it comes to having a target, I do agree with the idea that probably should be achievable, but I think that saying something, there are plenty of countries overall, especially in recent times in the post-pandemic world, who've been able to get down to like 0% as a percentage of like per 100,000 people, right? You're never going to get it down to zero specifically, but you can get it to approximately so. And I think that's probably a more, a target that wouldn't achieve headlines that allow you to get kind of discarded as being a party who's not looking serious. Unfortunately, as much as the principle behind the policy prescription is good, the optics are also what's important. I've talked a lot recently about kind of how optics really has to be your top goal. You're supposed to be trying to win people's hearts and minds rather than just trying to have just a set of principles. You need both of them at the same time. So that's probably what I'd go with. And that kind of dovetails in broadly to the fact that kind of the three main things that have been discussed throughout the mayoral election in London has been crime, housing, and the cost of living. And throughout kind of all of these different parts of it, what is interesting to see, I watched the debate on ITV, not the one on LBC, is that how much of the Labour policy platform has now converged to be close to the Green platform. Sadiq Khan even said, I agree with Zoe like 2 or 3 times on the debate that I watched in terms of more provision for council housing. In fact, I will give Sadiq Khan the plaudits when it comes to housing, that he has the best council housing record of any kind of mayoral authority within the entire country. In fact, basically the only place you really see broad-scale council house building is in London, which of course the Greens back too. And when it comes to crime policy, actually Zoe Garber was really good when she was specifically saying, well, actually we need to tackle the causes of crime. We need to deal with relative poverty. We need to deal with the fact that austerity has stripped out youth clubs and Sure Start, all of the different things that we need to ensure that people from underprivileged backgrounds have all of the necessary things to build a proper life. That means they won't turn to a life of crime. And that was also echoed by Sadiq Khan in the debate as well, this idea of there being tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, for example, which is again something that I would broadly agree with. And when it comes down to cost of living, the idea that we should have free school meals for all school-age children, primary and secondary, I fully support. And it's been a Green policy for a very long time. And his current policy under Lutfur Rahman in Tower Hamlets as well. So it's shown that it is possible. And of course, on the means testing argument, Susan Hall I just fundamentally disagree. And there's 2 main reasons for this. The first of all is like you save money by means testing usually, because you have to administer the means test and pay all of the overheads for that. You don't have to have a payment system for those who aren't members of it. But for political reasons, it means that first of all, you don't single out those who are the recipients of it, but it also stops there being a sense of resentment from those who don't receive it, when it comes to, everyone's getting their free stuff. Why am I getting free stuff? Well, if you give everybody the free things, it makes it far more politically useful to do so. So that's something that that's been long-time Green policy I fully support. What's interesting, the Tories have kind of given up. She's not their first choice, remember. There was another candidate who got removed from the selection. She was the second choice candidate, really and truly at this point. And it seems to me that since they know they can't win, they've kind of, as we saw from that weird advert that they put out a couple of weeks ago, the weird one about London under Sadiq Khan, it seems to be what they're trying to do is trying to undermine London more broadly and use that as a blueprint for the rest of the election around the country by using London as a scapegoat on the assumption that they just abandon London politically because they barely win anywhere in London anymore. One last point I would make. It's great. It's really good that we have more of these political debates, more political engagement across our screens as well. But why are we having multiple televised debates for the London mayoral race when we're having nothing of the same things for West Midlands, East Midlands, the North East mayor, a really important one, because people like Jamie Driscoll getting a platform to speak up, and all the other mayoralties around the country. I would love to see more high-profile televised debates from other areas of the country that are just as important as London. I think the news media probably has correct criticism for being too London-centric. I'd like to see that broadened up, especially in a post-levelling up world, at least rhetorically.
If you're into apocalyptic imagery, you'll be sorry you weren't in central London this morning.
We don't know what's going on with these pictures. We're going to share them with you. Have a look at it, and then I'll tell you as much as we know. Yeah, that is blood, we're told, on that horse.
That is blood on that horse. Jesus Christ. Apparently the Big Ben clock also stopped this morning. There's lots of apocalyptic symbolism going on. Don't worry, though. It's not the end of the world. Those were 2 of 5 horses that escaped from a household cavalry exercise in central London this morning. So that's what they do at the Buckingham Palace, I suppose, where the changing of the guards and all that. Apparently they were spooked by some nearby builders moving rubble. The horses escaped into busy tourist areas of the city, injuring 4 people and smashing into vehicles. Does look quite terrifying, which might explain the blood on one of them. Well, I hope that's not blood from a person. I hope that's blood from the horse. Not that I want the horse to get injured, but I mean, if that were blood from a person, that would be disastrous. I assume it's that horse ran into something. All 5 horses were later recaptured, though 2 were injured. They went all the way from Buckingham Palace to Limehouse. They went all the way across London. Must have been quite terrifying for them, but also quite terrifying for everyone who was near them. Helena, could this be sort of the start of how in those sort of Spanish towns they have sort of the run of the bull, and then sort of everyone's sort of like standing up on the walls? I mean, obviously that's some animal cruelty there, isn't there? Because they're all are they trying to kill the bull? I'm not sure. Or is it just that the bull goes to the bottom? Anyway, should we have more horses free to run the streets of London? Shake things up a bit.
If it was me, I'd be absolutely terrified. That the sight of a animal rushing towards me, I would be absolutely piss myself if that was me. Do I will say, as one thing this did remind me of is this clip from the Day Today, where it's just like there's now been an infestation of horses on the London Underground. When we'd seen coverage of this particular story, I was instantly expecting the newsreaders to go, and we'll cut to Ted Moll with the report on the escaped horses in London. It's all that could do my thinking whilst I was looking at this story today.
Let's wrap up there. Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been a pleasure as always.
As always, one thing I will say, obviously, really love the idea of more debates. One right wing I would love to see on Novara Live, bit of a left field suggestion here. I'd love to see Nadine Dorries on here. Bit of a character, and the things that she said about the back end of the Conservative Party, I think is super interesting considering her background, because she's more of a working class Tory. That's somebody I'd love to see come onto Novara Media and give her side of her story.
The problem is that would be somewhat controversial, because I think lots of our audience, when a right-winger comes on, they'll expect us to really disagree with them. And I've really got a soft spot for Nadine Dorries, as our regular viewers will know. I would love to do that, though. I'm sure we can find some things we've got plenty of things to disagree on. I just think she's kind of also a camp icon. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Please don't unsubscribe to the channel because I said that, or cancel your regular donation because you know that I'm soft on Nadine Dorries. Everyone has their weaknesses. Come back tomorrow for another stream from 6 p.m. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.